Okay, so today I'm telling you a story, and the story has an ending, a point that hopefully you'll find useful in your career as a software engineer or whatever it is that you do. I am a storyteller by nature, so hope you enjoy the story and be patient. It'll all come together at the end, I promise. Okay, so who the hell am I? I'm Coraline Ada Ehmke. Last year, I retired from software engineering after a 26-year career. I'm pretty well known as a big time open source troublemaker, starting in 2014 with the creation of Contributor Covenant, which was the first and still the most popular code of conduct for open source communities. Also, the author of the Post Meritocracy Manifesto. In 2019, I created the Hippocratic License, which is the premier ethical open source license, and also founded and I serve as the executive director of the Organization for Ethical Source. And you may have seen some guitars and keyboards behind me. That's because I write and record spooky music at NoSignal.zone. All right, so let's get into it. First, let's meet our heroes. Thomas Edison, born in the mid 1800s, well-known inventor, credited with the creation of the phonograph, the motion picture camera, and the first practical light bulb. Edison was a very practical man, really good at execution, but also really resistant to change. But he was known for his ability to really sell an idea. Edison's first patent was for what he called the electrographic vote recorder in 1869. And a friend of his, a telegraph operator named DeWitt Roberts, bought an interest in the machine for $100 and tried to sell it to Washington. But Congress wanted no part of any device that would increase the speed of voting, decreasing the time for filibusters, wheeling and dealing, and so on. So Edison's vote recorder was sent to the political graveyard. But he did have some successful early patents, and he invested the money he made from them into what he called his invention factory, a facility in Menlo Park, New Jersey, which he staffed with physicists, mechanics, engineers, machinists, and so forth. Nikola Tesla, on the other hand, also born in the mid 1800s, he studied engineering and physics, but like me, dropped out of college and unfortunately died penniless in obscurity in New York City at a late age of 86. He was rediscovered in the 1990s and became sort of a folk hero or anti hero for a lot of folks. And as we're going to learn, he was an alternating current aficionado. So Tesla was one of the world's most creative problem solvers, not bound by convention, but also very naive. Tesla worked from various labs around New York City through the 1890s to the early 1900s. This photograph is a lab that he built in Colorado Springs in 1899 to study the conductive power of low pressure air. Tesla applied for his first patent, an electric arc lamp, in 1884, immediately after leaving Edison's company and founding his own Tesla Electric Light and Manufacturing. Before we get into the story between Edison and Tesla, by way of background, we need to talk a little bit about the history of the generator. So in 1831, Michael Faraday discovered the operating principle of electromagnetic generators. The principle, which was called Faraday's law, is that an electrical force is generated in a conductor that is subject to varying magnetic flux. For example, a wire moving through a magnetic field. Faraday built the first electromagnetic generator called the Faraday disk using a copper disk rotating between the poles of a magnet, and it produced a very small DC voltage. That same year, a man named Hippolyte Pixie, and I swear I'm not making up that name, improved the generator by using a wire-wound horseshoe with the extra coils of conductor generating more current, but it was AC, alternating current, and that was considered a flaw at the time. William Cooke and Charles Wheatstone were inventors who made their name with improvements to the telegraph. Wheatstone and Cooke also made an important improvement in generators by replacing the permanent magnet with a battery-powered electromagnet, and they patented this invention in 1845. By the 1860s, this type of dynamo or generator was common. The first practical generator capable of powering electrical devices was called the Graham machine, created by Z.T. Graham, who was a Belgian electrical engineer, and he started selling them in the 1870s. Things really changed in 1878 at the Paris Exposition, where there was a demonstration of brilliant arc lights. And the people were so amazed, and this had like a repercussion across the world. Investors started selling off gas utility stocks because they saw that the world was waking up to the potential of electric power. which brings us to the so-called War of the Currents. So Thomas Edison held on to the idea that direct current was the best way to deliver electrical power to the world, and Tesla believed in the superiority of alternating current, and thus started the War of the Currents, which raged on for nearly 20 years. So the first large-scale power station in America was Edison's Pearl Street station in New York, and that began operating in 1882. The station had six 200 horsepower Edison dynamos, each powered by a separate steam engine. It was located in a business and commercial district and supplied 110 volts of direct current to 85 customers, lighting 400 lamps. But Edison's direct current generators were terribly inefficient, and they also couldn't deliver power over distances of more than a few city blocks. So in 1884, at the suggestion of a friend, Edison hired Tesla to improve his DC generators and offered him a $50,000 reward if he was successful, which is a ton of money in the 1800s. So even though Tesla thought that DC generators really had no future, he set to work and ended up making significant enhancements to Edison's generators. And when he went to claim his reward, Edison laughed and said that he'd been joking and that Tesla, as a Serbian, had no grasp of American humor. Tesla was devastated, and he had to resort to digging ditches and other odd jobs to raise money to start his company. So he set out to try to come up with a better way to generate alternating current. He developed a steam-powered reciprocating electricity generator. Basically, the way it worked is that steam would be forced into an oscillator and rush out through a series of ports, which pushed a piston attached to an armature. The magnetic armature vibrated up and down at high speed, which produced an alternating magnetic field. And this induced alternating electric current in the wire coils. It did away with the complicated parts of a steam engine, but no one really seemed interested in the invention. Tesla's invention, however, was saved from obscurity when it caught the attention of engineers at Westinghouse. So, Westinghouse Electric asked Tesla to participate in the 1893 Columbian Exposition in Chicago, where the company had rented a large space in a building devoted to electrical exhibits. Westinghouse won the bid to light the exposition with alternating current, and it was a key event in the history of alternating current power. The company demonstrated to the American public that it was safe, reliable, and efficient. By 1902, 61% of generating capacity in the US was alternating current, increasing to 95% by 1917. AC power had the advantage of enabling long distance power transmission. So finally, it was able to connect different stations to balance loads to meet demand. Interconnection became increasingly desirable as electrification grew rapidly in the early years of the 20th century. The War of the Currents was won through the partnership between George Westinghouse and Nikola Tesla. And Edison, who was beaten at last, shifted his focus to other inventions. Today, the world consumes about 160 petawatt hours of power, and electricity accounts for 10% of the world's gross domestic product. So we have to go a little bit sideways now and talk about the elephant in the room. There's a term in French called l'esprit de l'escalier, and I can't pronounce French, so forgive me. Literally translated, it means the spirit of the staircase. The term was coined in 1773 by French philosopher Diderot. It came to him when someone at a dinner party made a cutting remark that left him speechless. And he found himself formulating a response on his way home afterward. So the spirit of the staircase refers to the inspiration for a perfect comeback, combined with the irony of having thought of that comeback long after the event had happened, like when you've left a friend's party and you're walking downstairs to your car. Edison made a big display of the spirit of the staircase with a 1903 film called Electrocuting an Elephant. Edison had, for the past 15 years or so, been experimenting with electricity as a humane way of euthanizing animals. And this method of killing was generally approved by animal rights activists at the time. So this is Topsy. Topsy was a circus elephant, and she was something of a problem child. She'd killed a spectator the year before, but he deserved it. He burned her trunk with a cigar, and he had on multiple occasions attacked her handlers. The circus that owned her thought she was too big a threat to their operations, so they decided to put her down, and this is where Edison came in. The event of the electrocution of Topsy was captured and released by the Edison Film Company as a 74-second silent film in 1903. And as a side note, this was the first time that death was captured on camera. Edison's film shows the euthanization of Topsy at an under construction fairground in Coney Island. When the film was being promoted, its producers make sure to emphasize that the apparatus used to electrocute Topsy with 6,600 volts of electricity was an AC generator, the same kind of generator that Edison had been saying for years was too dangerous for widespread use. Now, by 1903, he'd already lost the war of the currents, but apparently Edison could just not let it go. So the spirit of the staircase. A friend of mine, Max, told me when he saw this talk, the fact is, if you have to publicly murder an elephant to make your point, you are likely on the wrong side of whatever it is you're trying to argue. So both Edison and Tesla are often portrayed as lone geniuses, turning out invention after invention. But is this really an accurate view? The notion of the lone genius came about during the Enlightenment. In previous centuries, invention was naturally thought of as a collaborative process that relied on networks of people working together and building on historical precedents. But when Britain enacted the first copyright law in 1710, it gave credence to the idea of inventors as originators and owners of ideas. Harvard scholar Marjorie Garber wrote in a book called Shakespeare's Ghostwriters that it was during the Romantic era in the late 18th century that the cult of the genius emerged. And Shakespeare is held up as a prime example of the type. Despite evidence that Shakespeare borrowed heavily from other poets and other playwrights and collaborated extensively, he's often held up as an example of natural genius. In his book, The Powers of Two, author and essayist Joshua Schenck responds to the myth of the lone genius by exploring the role of partnership and collaboration. In his book, he emphasizes that success arises from creative and innovative relationships. Success through partnership extends beyond duos like the Wright brothers or the Curies, and in some cases, the relationships are collaborative. But even when the relationships are adversarial, they always have an undeniable and critical interpersonal component. As I mentioned, Edison had invented the money he made from his early patents into the so called invention factory. The engineers and machinists who worked there called themselves muckers. And the muckers were responsible for generating hundreds of patents over a period of just a few years. But the muckers had problems. They didn't have commercial success for their inventions at first. But soon they discovered that when they tried to sell their ideas, the audience responded better to the idea of a single individual being responsible for the invention. And the rising celebrity of Edison's name was too valuable to ignore. So the muckers began to publicly attribute their collective work to his genius. Francis Gell, who was one of Edison's longtime assistants, even wrote that Edison was, in reality, a collective noun. As for Tesla, we saw that he repeatedly failed to succeed on his own. He needed people like Westinghouse to believe in him and make his inventions practical. The conclusion that Schenck comes to is that working relationships like Edison and the Muckers or Tesla and Westinghouse are, in fact, the fundamental engine of the creative process. In a 2014 paper called Human Cumulative Culture, researchers in cognitive evolution posited that complex technological advancements were unambiguously cumulative. The paper describes how transmission of knowledge gives rise to traits more complex than any individual could develop on their own, something they described as a ratcheting effect on technological complexity and capabilities. The authors argue that understanding the progress of human endeavors is only possible by examining the social processes that they rely on, such as competition or collaboration. And we know that, like other technological endeavors, software development also requires collaboration with stakeholders, our fellow coders, designers, technical writers, managers, and end users. And even in the open source world, where developers are often motivated to scratch their own itch, if you will, projects don't really gain success usually without the assistance of other people, either collaborators in the code base or documentation writers, people giving talks or even writing books about a given tool or framework. So I believe that each and every one of us can move along a spectrum between the raw creative power of a Tesla and the practical and methodical approach of an Edison. But we may have, as a default, a comfort zone, an inclination to one or the other. Let's take a look at what the Tesla archetype looks like. A Tesla style developer often works alone, solves difficult problems creatively, but may not like the boring work, writing tests, documentation. They may work in bursts of energy and have long periods of low productivity. And if they are very, very much like Tesla, they may have a weakness for pigeons. So Tesla was one of the world's most creative problem solver, not bound by convention, very naive. If you fall into the Tesla developer category, there are certain behaviors that can help you be more effective. First, don't let anyone tell you that your ideas are impractical until they're proven. Believe in yourself, even when no one else does, and build partnerships to help your ideas take shape. The Edison developer archetype, on the other hand, may love pair programming, knows how to apply patterns to solve problems, probably writes comprehensive issues and PR descriptions, works at a steady velocity, and hopefully does not fantasize about electrocuting elephants. So, tips for the Edison developer. Edison was a very practical man and really good at execution, but he was resistant to change. So, if you're an Edison developer, you should make the most of your practical tendencies, but learn from your failures, embrace teamwork, and don't fight against radical ideas. Work and experiment to see if you can make them successful. So you might be wondering where you fall on the Edison Tesla scale. You may even aspire to be a shining example of one or the other. Or you may recognize that you move between the two extremes in different situations. And actually, that's kind of the ideal. The best developers I know can oscillate. They can move between Tesla and Edison modes as needed, whatever the problem at hand calls for. So, what can we learn from the War of the Currents, the successes and failures of Edison and Tesla? How can we apply them to collaborating in software? How can we invent and innovate in our organizations without, resorting to electrocuting elephants? As the systems we build evolve and grow, we sometimes have to experiment with new ways of doing things, but we want to operate within a culture of pragmatic innovation and creativity. While I was working as an architect at Stitch Fix, which was my last job before I retired, I set out to explore the problem and developed a three-step methodology I call the framework for responsible innovation. The first step is to evaluate the need for introducing a new technology, a new framework, or a new way of doing things. And to do that, we have to start by asking a series of questions. Why is the problem a priority? What business need makes it relevant? Is the current approach that we're taking really not solving the problem for us? Have we exhausted the potential of existing tools? And what was different when we adopted those tools? What's different today? There are two kinds of development of integration of technologies in an organization. The first is a strengthening effort, and it basically means investing time and energy to make an existing or older technology do something by re-engineering it or changing processes. Sometimes they pay off, but sometimes, like Edison investing in trying to make his DC generators more efficient, sometimes it can be a lost cause, and we need to try something different. So the alternative is a growth effort, and that involves exploring new tools and technologies to solve a problem. But growth efforts, investing in a new technology, can fail if clear parameters for success, are not established up front. You could end up like Tesla with amazing inventions that are utterly impractical. So it's important to weigh the need of an incremental versus a radical solution. So, if we do decide that investigating a new way of solving a problem is the way to go, we still have to be thoughtful and deliberate about it. So, the responsible innovation framework provides a tool for this, for evaluating alternatives, an exploratory matrix. It's got one axis describing ease of adoption and the other describing utility. And this matrix is designed to help us through our exploratory process. So, ease of adoption encompasses a number of considerations. Does the new tech enhance and fit well with what we have already? Will it be easy for us to learn to use effectively? Is there good documentation? Is there prior art? Is it flexible? Does it have a strong security story? Have we considered the overall cost, not only to our own team, but to other teams that have to support it? Utility or usefulness has its own set of questions. Does the new technology enhance the performance not only of our apps, but of our teams? Does it positively impact performance, stability, reliability? Is it well maintained? Does it have an active user base? Are there readily available support resources? And most importantly, does it solve the problem more efficiently or effectively than our current tool set? So starting in the bottom left of the quadrants, we have things that we want to reject outright. So these are technologies that are difficult to adopt and not as useful as we might want them to be. So we can reject those outright. Easy to adopt solutions that provide limited value are not likely to be adopted, but still might be worth exploring through play, because play can create learning opportunities and help us gain a new perspective on the problem space, even if we end up picking a different tool. Technologies that provide utility, they're useful, but they're difficult to adopt, fall into the wait category. They may be candidates for future adoption, but pretty much you have to wait until the technology matures to the point that you have tooling and training and documentation that'll make onboarding easier. And finally, solutions that are easy to adopt and accommodate a wide range of use cases, those are the ones we want to explore. And we can move on to the next phase, responsible experimentation. So we've asked the 6 questions. We've used the matrix to narrow down our options. So it's time to start to experiment, get our hands dirty, exploring how new technology might help us. But to be effective, we have to experiment safely and responsibly. So, what does that look like? What does a responsible experiment look like? Well, we start with a clearly defined problem. And at Stitch Fix, our convention was to always ask, what problem are you trying to solve? If you can't summarize it in 1 or 2 sentences, you may not understand the problem space enough. Next, we want to make sure that the experiment doesn't impact other systems too much, and that requires well-defined boundaries. And we want to have clear success criteria. When do we know when the experiment is successful? And we want to make sure that time and cost is constrained. You might call that time boxing. And we want to make sure that whatever we do, we can roll it back. We can undo it safely and quickly. So once we've done an experiment, we've seen that a given tech does or does not or does fit the problem space that we're working in. So the best engineering cultures actually empower us as engineers. They give us flexibility in the way we go about solving problems. Sometimes the solution we want, though, is it has an impact outside of our immediate situation or team. So we have to be careful and thoughtful about how other people across the org will be affected. And for this, we can adopt the RACI framework, RACI, RACI, which stands for responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed, 4 different categories. So the solution that we want to bring, the new technology we want to bring, may have a team scope. If who's responsible for an experiment that's in a team scope, an individual engineer or a small team of engineers. The manager, in collaboration with senior engineers, is accountable for it. We want to make sure that we consult the other members of the team, and we want to keep other engineers outside of our team informed about what we do because they may have similar needs. They may have tried a different solution, and at the very least, they might be interested to see what you learned and what you're doing. But sometimes the change we want to make impacts other teams or applications. In this case, we want to focus on creating and sharing documentation with managers and engineers from those teams. An example of cross team scope might be the extraction of a new service that has use by multiple teams. So we want to collaborate and iterate on it until we've agreed on an approach that meets the needs of everyone affected by the decision. So who's responsible? The small group of engineers drawn from multiple teams. These teams managers and senior engineers again are accountable for what happens. We want to make sure that we're consulting senior engineers across the org. We want to make sure we touch base with ops people and security teams. And we want to keep the broader engineering org informed because we have to socialize the experiment in a broader org. And we can point people to documentation, we can write wiki pages, we can give presentations, we can organize training and even Q&A sessions. So we want to follow a well-formulated plan. We want to document our findings. We want to show evidence that we thought thoughtfully about alternatives, and our experiment demonstrates success, all while keeping people informed. And a really important point here, especially as an engineering org grows, you don't have to have everyone in agreement. You don't have to have full consensus. Trust the process and trust your decision-making capabilities. So, final thoughts. True innovation requires genius and pragmatism. We can't just be an Edison or just be a Tesla if we want to be successful. We have to find the right balance. If we stubbornly hold on to our own ideas, ignore evidence to the contrary, we might find ourselves left behind, like Edison in the War of Currents. But if we don't partner with people who complement our way of working to solve problems, we might end up spending all of our time building things that frankly no one wants. Teslas solve impossible problems. Edison's make solutions practical. And the best developers can move along the spectrum between the Tesla and Edison extremes as the situation demands. By the way, if you're wondering if I am more of an Edison or Tesla, you can ask me which of the two I have tattooed on my shoulder. I have Ada Lovelace on my right shoulder with a halo, and Tesla here with on the left with devil horns. And my favorite Tesla quote: "Our virtues and failings are inseparable." A lot of the content for this talk, specifically the technology matrix, the experiment guidelines, came from a blog post I wrote called A Framework for Responsible Innovation, and you can find a link to it on my site, where.coraline.codes. Thank you so much.